The crazy part is, none of this would have happened if they just left my truck alone. I mean, seriously. I was a quiet tenant, paid my rent early every month, never blasted music, never caused problems. And yet, somehow, I ended up in the middle of this weird little power game that spiraled so far out of control it took down an entire towing company and almost split my apartment community in half. Looking back now, I still laugh about parts of it, but at the time, man, I was furious. And not the kind of angry where you yell and punch walls either. I'm talking about that cold, quiet anger where you stop talking because your brain starts keeping score. It started the weekend I drove down to Flagstaff to see my older sister, Melanie. She'd just had knee surgery, and honestly, I needed the break anyway. Work had been chewing me alive for months. My back hurt all the time, and my old Chevy Silverado was making this awful rattling noise every time I hit 45 on the freeway. But that truck and I had history. My dad bought it in '98, handed it to me before he passed, and somehow that beat-up thing became the one constant in my life through layoffs, breakups, bad apartments, all of it. So before leaving town Friday afternoon, I parked it where I always parked it, under this giant crooked sycamore tree near the west side of the complex. Same spot I'd used for almost 4 years. Everybody in the building knew that truck. Hell, old Mrs. Alvarez from Unit 12B used to joke that she checked for my Silverado every morning to make sure I hadn't died overnight. There were never assigned spaces in that lot. Never permits, never warning stickers, nothing. Our apartment manager, Denise, actually told me when I moved in, as long as your vehicle runs and you're not blocking anybody, nobody cares. So I left for the weekend without thinking twice. Then Monday morning happened. I got back around 6:30, tired as hell, still smelling like highway coffee and gas station beef jerky, and when I turned into the lot, I noticed something immediately felt wrong. You know how your brain recognizes patterns before you consciously do? That's what it was. The space under the tree looked naked, empty. I remember slowing the truck rental I borrowed from my brother-in-law and just staring for a second, like my eyes were waiting for reality to correct itself. But my Silverado was gone. At first, I honestly thought it got stolen. My stomach dropped so fast it physically hurt. I got out, walked around the lot twice like somehow I'd forgotten where I parked. Then I saw this bright red sign bolted into the curb near the tree. Reserved tenant parking. UNURI's Forest they subject to immediate towing. The sign looked brand new too, like the paint was still drying. And right then, something clicked to my head because that sign sure as hell wasn't there Friday. I stood there staring at it while this college kid from upstairs walked by carrying laundry. He kinda slowed down and went, "Hey man, you looking for the old Chevy?" I said, "Yeah." He pointed toward the office and goes, "HOA had a meltdown Saturday morning. Tow trucks came through at like 8 a.m., taking everybody they didn't recognize." Everybody they didn't recognize. That sentence stayed with me, because suddenly, this didn't feel random anymore. It felt personal. The HOA president, Randall Pierce, had moved into the neighboring townhouse about 6 months earlier, and from day one, the guy acted like he'd been elected king of suburban Arizona, always walking around in loafers and golf polos, carrying one of those stainless steel tumblers like it contained nuclear launch codes. He hated older vehicles too, said they lowered community value. Couple months earlier, he actually stopped me while I was washing my truck and asked if I planned on upgrading anytime soon. I laughed because I thought he was joking. He wasn't, and standing there in that empty parking spot, staring at that fresh sign, I had this ugly little feeling in my gut that Randall finally found a way to get rid of my truck without technically touching it himself. But I still didn't know how bad things were about to get. I went upstairs, dropped my bags by the door, and immediately started making calls. First the apartment office, no answer. Then the emergency maintenance line, which somehow redirected me to a voicemail box that was full. By that point, my hands were shaking, not even from panic anymore, just pure irritation. Finally, around 8:30, a receptionist from some property management company picked up and transferred me 3 different times before a guy with this bored smoker voice answered. "Cactus Valley Recovery." I said, "Yeah, I think you guys towed my truck illegally." He actually laughed a little before asking for the plate number. Couple keyboard clicks later, he goes, "Silverado? Yeah, we got it." Then he casually tells me the release fee was $36.40, cash only. I thought I misheard him. I literally pulled the phone away from my ear and stared at it. I said, "For a weekend tow?" He goes, "Storage fees, administrative processing, private property enforcement. The way he said it sounded rehearsed, like they repeated it 50 times a day. Then he added, and it accrues another $80 at midnight. That's the moment something changed in me. Because, see, when people get scammed like that, most either explode immediately or fold completely. I didn't do either. I got quiet. My dad used to say, when somebody wants you emotional, don't give them the satisfaction. So I just said, all right, hung up, showered, slept 4 hours, and drove out to their impound yard the next morning before sunrise. That place looked exactly how you'd imagine. Chain link fence topped with rusted barbed wire. Stray dogs barking somewhere behind the lot. Floodlights still buzzing from overnight. My Silverado sat wedged between a wrecked RV and a stripped Honda Civic like it had committed a felony. I remember putting my hand on the hood for a second, almost apologizing to the truck. Stupid, I know, but it felt violated somehow. Inside the office sat this woman chewing gum behind bulletproof glass, watching courtroom reruns on a tiny television. Didn't even look at me when she slid the paperwork through the slot. $36.40 in cash. I paid it, every painful dollar, but before signing anything, I asked for an itemized invoice and a copy of the tow authorization. She rolled her eyes hard enough to orbit the moon. Why? She asked. I said, because I like paperwork. That finally got her attention. She stared at me for a second, then handed over the documents. And there it was. Authorization requested by Randall Pierce, acting on behalf of the Canyon Ridge Homeowners Association. Signed Saturday morning, 7:12 a.m. The timestamp alone made me smile a little because now I knew two things. 1. Randall personally targeted that tow. And 2. He probably thought nobody would fight back. On my way home, I stopped for coffee at this old diner off Route 66 where my friend Nate worked mornings. Nate used to do insurance investigations before opening an auto shop, and the guy had this weird talent for spotting scams from a mile away. I slid the invoice across the counter while he refilled my coffee. He read it for maybe 20 seconds before whistling low. "Buddy," he said, "these numbers are insane." Then he tapped the paperwork and goes, "Administrative enforcement fee?" They made that crap up. We spent the next hour going through everything line by line while old country music played from the kitchen speakers. And somewhere in that greasy diner booth, this stopped being about my truck. It became about proving these people thought they could bully regular folks because most people are too exhausted to push back. So that afternoon, I pulled out my lease agreement and read every single page. Twice. Buried halfway through Section 8 was one sentence that changed the entire situation. Residents are entitled to unrestricted use of community parking areas unless otherwise stated in writing with 30 days notice. 30 days. Not overnight. Not surprise signs installed in the dark like some shady repo operation. 30 days. I just sat there at my kitchen table, staring at that line while the ceiling fan clicked overhead. Then I started digging deeper. Tuesday morning, I took off work and drove downtown to the municipal records office. The woman helping me looked exhausted in that uniquely government employee kind of way. But once I explained the towing situation, she actually leaned closer and quietly said, "You might want to search under consumer complaints too." Turns out Cactus Valley Recovery already had multiple violations filed against them. Illegal towing, predatory storage fees, failure to provide proper notice. One complaint even involved towing a disabled veteran's van during a hospital stay. And every single complaint traced back to HOA contracts around the county. That's when the bigger picture finally snapped into focus. Randall didn't just hire these guys randomly. They had a system. HOA boards pressure residents. Towing companies collect outrageous fees. Everybody gets a cut somehow. And the residents either pay quietly or get buried in bureaucracy trying to fight it. Honestly, the more I learned, the angrier I got. But underneath the anger was disappointment too, because communities aren't supposed to work like that. Most people move into these places wanting peace and stability, not neighborhood politics and intimidation tactics. But Randall loved control. You could feel it any time he walked into a room. About 3 months earlier, there'd been this argument at a community barbecue because he tried telling a single mom her son's basketball hoop didn't match neighborhood aesthetics. A basketball hoop. The guy treated the apartment complex like he was curating a museum nobody asked to visit. By Tuesday evening, I had a thick folder full of records, copies of the lease, photographs of the freshly installed signs, and screenshots of state towing regulations. And then I found the final piece. Arizona law required new towing enforcement signage to be displayed for at least 7 full days before active enforcement could begin. 7 days. Randall's signs went up Friday night according to maintenance records. My truck disappeared less than 12 hours later. I actually laughed out loud when I realized it, because suddenly this entire thing stopped feeling stressful. It felt winnable. So that night, I put on jeans, grabbed my folder, and walked straight into the HOA board meeting at the clubhouse. Nobody invited me. Didn't matter. About 20 residents sat in those little folding chairs eating stale cookies, while Randall stood near a projector screen pretending he was running a Senate hearing. The second he saw me walk in carrying paperwork, his expression changed, just slightly, but enough. "This meeting is for residents on the agenda," he said. Calm voice. Fake smile. I pulled out a chair anyway. "Good thing I live here then." A few people snorted quietly. Randall didn't like that. He adjusted his blazer and said, "Mr. Carter, if this is about your vehicle situation, the board has already acted within community guidelines." I looked him dead in the eye and said, "No, Randall, you acted within what you thought people would tolerate." Dead silence. You could hear the vending machine humming in the hallway. Then I dropped the folder on the table. Loud. Papers spilled everywhere. Complaint records, state statutes, photos, TOW invoices. "You illegally removed my vehicle less than 12 hours after posting signage," I said. "You violated the lease agreement, state towing law, and possibly consumer fraud statutes." Randall's smile finally disappeared. One of the older board members started flipping through the paperwork, looking genuinely nervous. Another lady whispered, "Jesus Christ," under her breath. Randall tried recovering fast. "Now hold on," he said. "The community has standards." I cut him off immediately. "No, communities have standards. Petty little control freaks abuse them." That one hit. Hard. His face went red instantly. But I wasn't done. I told them complaints had already been filed with the Attorney General's office, the city housing department, and a local investigative news reporter who apparently loved stories involving HOA corruption. That last part wasn't fully true yet, but it would be soon enough. And suddenly the room changed, because now it wasn't just about my truck anymore. It was liability, exposure, public embarrassment. The board members started looking at Randall differently, like maybe they were realizing he dragged them into something ugly. And for the first time since this whole mess started, Randall Pierce actually looked scared. The next morning, my phone started ringing before I even poured coffee. First, it was Denise from the property office sounding unusually polite, asking if maybe there was a misunderstanding we could resolve privately. Funny how people suddenly discover manners once lawyers and reporters get mentioned. I told her there was no misunderstanding. Somebody knowingly authorized an illegal TOW and tried squeezing nearly $4,000 out of a tenant over a parking space that had never been restricted before. She got real quiet after that. Around noon, Randall himself called me. And honestly, that was my favorite part of the whole story because his voice sounded completely different now. Gone was the smug HOA president tone. Gone was the neighborhood king routine. Now he sounded tired, nervous even. "Ethan," he said, "I think the situation has escalated unnecessarily." I almost laughed. Unnecessarily? Like I was the one who hired a predatory tow company at 7 in the morning. I said, "You took my truck." "Randall, not just a vehicle either. That truck belonged to my dad." Long silence. Then he goes, "Well, nobody knew there was sentimental value attached." That sentence right there told me everything about the guy because to him, empathy only mattered if an object came with emotional resale value. I remember leaning back in my kitchen chair staring out the window at my Silverado, parked under that sycamore tree again, finally back where it belonged, and realizing this was probably how Randall handled every conflict in his life. Push hard enough and most people backed out. But every once in a while you push the wrong person on the wrong week and suddenly the whole machine starts rattling apart. By Thursday afternoon, they offered to refund the towing charges entirely. I said no. Then they offered reimbursement plus reasonable inconvenience compensation. Also no. Nate thought I was crazy at first. We were sitting outside his shop drinking beer after closing when he goes, "Dude, take the money and move on." But I couldn't, because somewhere along the way this stopped being about revenge. It became about drawing a line. I kept thinking about the disabled veteran whose van got towed, or the single mom Randall embarrassed over a basketball hoop, or all the exhausted people who probably paid these fees because fighting back felt impossible after working 10-hour shifts and raising kids and surviving life. Predatory people count on exhaustion. That's their whole business model. So Friday morning I sent over my terms. They were simple. 1. Compensate me $1,000 per day for every day my truck sat in impound. 2. Terminate the HOA contract with Desert State Recovery immediately. And 3. Sign a written policy preventing future towing enforcement without proper written notice and direct resident communication. Denise called me 20 minutes after reading it and actually said, "You can't seriously expect us to agree to this." I said, "No, I expect you're scared enough to." Another long silence. By then, the local news station had returned my email too. Turns out, HOA abuse stories get clicks like crazy, especially in Arizona. By Friday afternoon, Randall and 2 board members asked to meet in person at the clubhouse. I almost said no just to irritate him, but honestly, I wanted to see his face one last time. The energy in that room felt completely different from the meeting earlier that week. Nobody was pretending to be in charge anymore. Randall looked exhausted. Tie loosened. Dark circles under his eyes like he hadn't slept. He slid the settlement papers across the table without making eye contact. Total payout came to $9,500 after fees and damages. I flipped through the pages slowly on purpose, just letting the silence sit there heavy. Then I noticed the final clause confirming termination of their towing agreement. "So, Cactus Valley's done?" I asked. Randall nodded once, quietly. "Effective immediately." Man, I can't even explain how satisfying that felt. Not because of the money either. The money was nice, sure, but watching somebody who spent months flexing fake authority finally realize actions have consequences, that hits different. Before leaving, Randall tried one last little jab. He goes, "This whole thing has created a lot of tension in the community." I looked at him and said, "No, Randall. Accountability created tension for the people benefiting from the lack of it." Then I signed the papers and walked out. Couple residents standing outside actually clapped when I came through the doors. Mrs. Alvarez hugged me so hard I thought my ribs cracked. The college kid from upstairs yelled, "Save the Chevy," like it was some kind of political campaign slogan. Even Denise laughed at that one. And the crazy thing is, once people realized somebody finally pushed back successfully, stories started pouring out. Residents talking about intimidation fines, selective rule enforcement, shady towing threats. One guy claimed Randall threatened penalties because his garage door stayed open during a football game. Another woman said they fined her over wind chimes. Wind chimes. The whole place had been operating under this weird cloud of low-level fear where everybody stayed quiet because they thought they were alone. They weren't. Within a month, Randall resigned from the HOA board. Officially, it was for personal reasons, which is usually corporate language for somebody got caught acting like an idiot. Desert State Recovery lost 3 other HOA contracts shortly after because apparently county investigators had already started looking into them before my complaint even landed. 6 months later, they were gone completely. Business dissolved. And every once in a while, I still think about how close they came to getting away with it all over a stupid parking spot under a tree. These days, my Silverado still sits in the same place every night. Paint faded, engine rattling, little oil stain underneath and all. Nobody says a word about it anymore. Sometimes I'll catch new neighbors glancing at the truck, then looking toward the clubhouse like they heard rumors. And maybe they did. Honestly though, part of me still wonders if I went too far. Nate says I scorched the earth over a tow bill. My sister says people like Randall only learn lessons the hard way. Maybe both are true. But I'll tell you this, if somebody abuses a tiny bit of power long enough, eventually, they forget regular people can fight back too. And when that day comes, it usually starts with something small. A parking space, a warning letter, a truck under a tree. So now I want to ask you guys, was I justified for pushing until the towing company collapsed and the HOA basically imploded? Or should I have just taken the refund and let it go? Because honestly, even now, I still go back and forth on that sometimes. Let me know down in the comments. And if you've ever dealt with HOA insanity or some power-hungry neighbor who thought they owned the whole block, hit subscribe, because trust me, this story isn't even the craziest one I've lived through.